Just before 2 o'clock on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, a woman opens her phone. She waits 25 seconds before she dials. On the other end, an emergency operator asks her what has happened. "I don't know," she says. "I was in the other room. He's carried a tray in, and all I can see is the tray." She is told to begin chest compressions. It will be more than 6 minutes before she actually starts. When paramedics arrive at the house, they find an 84-year-old man on the kitchen floor, a broken plate beside him, a small kitchen knife nearby. His wife tells them he slipped and fell onto the blade he was carrying. For a while, everyone believes her. This is the case of David Berman and his wife, Daryl Berman. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. David Berman was 84 years old. Within his local community in Prestwich, part of Greater Manchester with a long-established Jewish population, he was known as a prominent and well-regarded figure, someone whose presence in local life extended well beyond his own front door. By March of 2025, David's life had recently changed in a significant way. A retired joiner, he had been diagnosed with vascular dementia, and his declining health meant he had come to rely on a walking stick to get around. For many families, a diagnosis like this quietly reshapes almost every part of daily life, from simple routines to the dynamics of a marriage built over decades. David and his wife Daryl had been married for 27 years. Photographs shared publicly after his death show a warm, smiling man, the kind of image families choose specifically because it reflects who someone truly was to them, rather than how their life came to an end. On the afternoon of the 13th of March, David appears to have been doing something entirely unremarkable, carrying his wife's lunch tray through to the kitchen of his own home, leaning on his walking stick as he went. It was the same home he had shared with his wife for nearly 3 decades, in a quiet residential street that had, until that day, given the outside world no reason to think anything was wrong inside it. He would not survive that afternoon. His death left a genuine void within his community, the kind that becomes clear only in the aftermath, when the ordinary rhythms of local life, the people who would see him regularly, the routines he had been part of for years, suddenly had to continue without him. That is the version of David Berman worth holding on to as this case unfolds, not simply the elderly man at the center of a police investigation, but a husband, a familiar face, and a long-standing part of the community he had belonged to for most of his adult life. Daryl Berman was 71 years old at the time of her husband's death. To their friends, their wider family, and their local community, she and David were simply a long married couple, together for 27 years, now navigating the early stages of his dementia diagnosis together. This is a detail worth stating plainly and directly. Unlike many of the cases examined on this channel, prosecutors in this case explicitly acknowledged that there was no known history of violence in David and Daryl's marriage. There were no prior reports to police, no pattern of controlling behavior uncovered at trial, no documented history of conflict that outsiders could point to afterwards and say, in hindsight, that the warning signs had always been there. What existed instead, by all outward appearances, was an ordinary elderly couple adjusting to an increasingly difficult new reality. Caring for a partner with dementia is widely recognized as one of the most demanding forms of caregiving that exists, combining round-the-clock responsibility with the slow, ongoing grief of watching someone you love change in front of you. Whether or not that pressure played any role in what happened on the 13th of March, it forms part of the honest context of this case, a marriage of nearly 3 decades, recently reshaped by illness, with nothing in its documented history to suggest where it was heading. That absence of any obvious warning sign is precisely what makes this case so difficult to categorize, and precisely why the events of that single afternoon would end up requiring so much forensic and legal scrutiny to fully understand. It is worth pausing on how unusual this makes Daryl Berman's profile compared with many other cases examined on this channel. She was simply David's wife of 27 years, a woman now facing the same slow, difficult adjustment that so many families navigate when dementia enters a long marriage. Unlike many of the cases covered on this channel, there is no clear, documented build-up to describe here, no escalating threats, no witnessed arguments, no pattern of behavior in the weeks before the 13th of March that anyone has since pointed to as a turning point. What is known is the practical shape of David and Daryl's daily life by that point. What can be said with certainty is this. On an ordinary Thursday afternoon, inside a home that had given no outward indication of danger, something happened between two people who had spent nearly 3 decades together. Whatever it was, only one of them survived it, and she has never given an account of it that investigators, or ultimately a jury, found to be true. Shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Thursday the 13th of March 2025, David Berman sustained a stab wound to the chest inside the kitchen of his home on Butterstile Lane in Prestwich. Phone records later showed that Daryl opened her phone at 14 minutes and 46 seconds past 1 and did not call emergency services until 25 seconds after that. During the call, she told the operator she had been in another room, that her husband had carried a tray through, and that she believed a small knife on that tray may have gone into him. She said he had slipped, and that blood was coming from his mouth. At one point during the call, she fell silent and appeared to answer another incoming call. The operator instructed her to begin chest compressions. Records showed it was more than 6 minutes into the call before she did. When paramedics arrived, they found David on the kitchen floor, with the tray, a paring knife measuring 12 centimeters, and a broken plate lying nearby. Attempts were made to resuscitate him, but he was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes later. In her account to police, Daryl described her husband carrying a tray with a plate, a cup, and a knife into the kitchen, hearing a noise as though he had fallen, and hearing him call out that he was fine, that he had simply slipped. She said she then heard a groan, ran into the kitchen, and found him lying face down. At the scene, officers initially accepted this account as a tragic accident. However, investigators noted specific concerns about Daryl's demeanor. She was described as very calm and matter-of-fact, and despite telling officers she had rolled her husband over, she had very little blood on her. As officers arrived on the driveway of the house, body-worn footage captured her, asking them directly, "You don't think I murdered him, do you?" Daryl Berman was arrested 5 days later after concerns raised during the post-mortem examination prompted a formal murder investigation. She was subsequently charged and appeared at Manchester's Minshull Street Crown Court by video link from custody. At trial, prosecutors also pointed to an entry Daryl had written on her calendar on the very day her husband died, the words "bye-bye," alongside a heart and 2 kisses, which she told the court was simply her ordinary habit of marking the end of each day. Her first trial began later that year. Prosecutors told the jury that Daryl had deliberately stabbed her husband for a reason known only to her, while she maintained throughout that his death had been a tragic accident. The trial concluded on the 19th of December 2025, when the 10 jurors were unable to reach a verdict, and the jury was discharged. A retrial took place the following year, running from the 22nd of June to the 3rd of July 2026, at the same court. On the 23rd of June, a new jury reached a guilty verdict on an 11-to-1 majority. On the 3rd of July, Daryl Berman was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 12 years to serve before she becomes eligible to apply for parole. 2 trials, spanning close to a year and a half from David's death to a final verdict, reflected just how difficult this case was to prove without a confession, a witness, or an admitted motive. What ultimately persuaded a second jury, where the first had been unable to agree, was not any single new piece of evidence, but the same body of forensic and behavioral findings presented again and weighed once more against Daryl's unchanged account. Because Daryl Berman consistently maintained that her husband's death had been an accident, this case depended almost entirely on forensic and behavioral evidence to establish what had actually happened inside that kitchen. The post-mortem examination was the single most important piece of evidence in the case. 2 separate pathologists examined David's injuries and concluded that they were more consistent with a deliberately inflicted wound than with an accidental fall onto a knife, noting that the blade had entered his chest with severe force, far beyond what a simple stumble could account for. This finding directly contradicted Daryl's account and became the reason the case, initially treated as a tragic accident, was reopened as a murder investigation. A specific injury to the middle finger of David's right hand added further weight to that conclusion. Prosecutors identified it as a potential defensive wound, the kind of injury a person can sustain while instinctively trying to protect themselves or push away an object during an attack, rather than the kind of injury typically associated with an accidental fall. Behavioral evidence at the scene proved equally significant. Officers noted that Daryl appeared calm and composed immediately after what she described as a horrific accident, and that she had very little blood on her despite claiming to have physically rolled her husband's body over. In cases involving sudden traumatic loss, investigators are trained to note this kind of disparity, not as definitive proof on its own, but as one thread within a much larger pattern. Digital evidence added a precise timeline to that pattern. The 25-second gap between Daryl opening her phone and placing the emergency call, though brief in isolation, became meaningful once placed alongside the delay that followed it. The more than 6 minutes that passed before she began chest compressions, despite being clearly instructed to do so by the emergency operator. Neither detail alone proves intent. Together, they describe a sequence of hesitation that sat uneasily alongside her account of a desperate, panicked response to finding her husband injured. None of these individual pieces of evidence, taken alone, could have secured a conviction. It was the combination, 2 independent pathological opinions, a specific defensive injury, an unexplained calm at the scene, and a documented, measurable delay in seeking and administering help that ultimately allowed prosecutors to build a case substantial enough to convince a jury on the second attempt beyond reasonable doubt. On the 3rd of July 2026, at Manchester's Minshall Street Crown Court, Judge Tina Landale sentenced Daryl Berman to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 12 years before she becomes eligible to apply for parole. The judge told her she was satisfied Daryl had not intended to kill her husband, but had intended to cause him really serious harm, adding that Daryl had never given a truthful account of what had actually happened. In her remarks, the judge also noted that Daryl had, by all accounts, historically been a nurturing carer to David, and suggested that she had most likely lost her patience or her temper in a single, catastrophic moment. It is the closest anyone in this case has come to offering an explanation, and even that remains an observation from the bench, not a fact established beyond doubt. Speaking after the sentencing, Detective Inspector Alex Wilkinson from Greater Manchester Police's Major Incident Team said David Berman was an 84-year-old man who should have been able to enjoy his later years in the safety of his own home, and that instead, his life was cut short by the person he trusted most. He added that Daryl had attempted to present her husband's death as a tragic accident throughout the entire investigation, and that it was ultimately the findings of the post-mortem examination that exposed the truth. It is worth returning one final time to who David Berman was before any of this happened. A man well known and well regarded within his local community, a husband of 27 years, a man who, in the final stage of his life, was navigating a difficult diagnosis with the person he had built that life alongside. None of what came afterwards changes who he was in the decades before it. This case remains, in one important sense, unfinished. 2 trials, a full forensic examination, and more than a year of legal proceedings were never able to answer the one question so many of these cases eventually do resolve: why? Daryl Berman has never offered the courts, or her husband's family, a truthful explanation for what happened inside that kitchen on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. For now, that question remains exactly where the jury ultimately left it, unanswered, but no longer in doubt about who was responsible. If you want to understand how investigators can rebuild the truth of a case using nothing but small, easily overlooked pieces of evidence, that is exactly what this channel is for. Every day, we break these cases down properly, without the noise, so hit subscribe if that is something you want more of. Thank you for watching.